Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of Retirement Clarity Radio. I am your host Scott Newhouse, really excited that you are with me. Today we're going to be talking about something that we talked about a few episodes ago. We're going to be talking about the 4% rule, and I talked about that on episode number 35 of this podcast, and it's also on my YouTube channel. You can just search for it there. And I also talked about something we're going to be talking about today, which is dynamic distribution / creating your retirement paycheck. That's episode number 36. And so just want to point those out as a reference tool as you listen to this episode if you want to make sure that you get everything that I'm saying in terms of this episode as well as the previous ones, because that's really important. We are going to be talking about today is the 4% rule, that rule of thumb that we've heard so often. Is that should that be a 3.3% rule? In other words, should we decrease the 4% rule down to a 3.3% rule? And this is coming from a study done by Morningstar. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to be talking about CNBC kind of wrote an article outlining everything here. So we'll be talking about CNBC and Morningstar's research on this issue. And then we'll also talk about why I don't love the idea of using a 4% rule or even a 3.3% rule to get your retirement income needs met in retirement. So let's go through the CNBC article. I'm going to be reading a little bit of it, and then I'll add my own commentary and my recommendations later on in the episode. So let's just jump right into it. The 4% rule, a popular strategy to gauge withdrawals from one's retirement portfolio, won't work as well in coming decades due to lower projected stock and bond returns, according to a Morningstar paper published Thursday, can't read. Now, the withdrawal rate should be 3.3% instead, says Morningstar, and that can obviously have a big impact on retirees. So, market conditions are pressuring the 4% rule, a popular rule of thumb for retirees, to determine how much money they can live on each year without fear of running out later. And that's a really important point for the 4% rule. Withdrawing money from one's nest egg is among the most complex financial exercises for households. There are many unknowns: the length of one's retirement, one's spending needs, and investment returns, to name a few. Now, the 4% rule is meant to yield a consistent stream of annual income and give seniors a high degree of comfort that their funds will last over 30 years. Simply put, the rule says retirees can withdraw 4% of their total value of their investment portfolio in the first year of retirement. So let's say you have $1 million in your investment accounts. The 4% rule says you can take out $40,000 in that first year. Now, the dollar amount increases with inflation, i.e. the cost of living, the following year as it would the year after that, and on and on and on. However, says CNBC, market conditions, namely lower projected returns for stocks and bonds, don't seem to be working in retirees' favor. Given market expectations, the 4% rule may no longer be feasible for seniors, according to Morningstar. These days, the 4% rule should be the 3.3% rule. Now, you might be asking, why is it the 3.3% rule now? Well, over the last decade, we've had low inflation, we've had low bond yields, which have boosted bond prices, and then we've also had really strong stock returns, and that has helped increase all of our investment portfolios, and it's increased the safe withdrawal rates. But Morningstar does not think it's likely that those three things will last for the next 30 years. And so they don't think they think bonds are highly unlikely to enjoy strong gains over the next 30 years. They think the high stock prices we have now are likely to fall as they revert back to the average. And they do think, even though inflation has been really high the last 12 months or so, they think inflation will be moderate over the long term, but not necessarily low. So they think moderate, not necessarily low, like we have had the last decade or so. And so that's pretty much the summation of CNBC's article. And so they're essentially saying, hey, we've had this 4% rule that was created in 1994. And again, I've talked about that on episode number 35 of this podcast. We've had this 4% rule, but given the market conditions now, given the high stock prices that we've had, the increase in bond values that we've had, the next 30 years may not be as good as the last 30 years. So they are lowering their adjustments to make it the 3.3% rule instead of the 4% rule. So again, if we had that $1 million portfolio and you use the 4% rule, you can take out $40,000 a year and then adjust it for inflation. If we have the 3.3% rule, you would take out $33,000 per year and adjust it for inflation there. And that's obviously a really big difference. That's $7,000 over the course of the year. That's a really big difference in terms of your retirement income that you can generate from your investment accounts. And so that's why this is so important. Now, if you have listened to my previous episodes, you will know that I'm not a fan of using the 4% rule in your retirement for your distributions. And I mentioned this in episode number 35. I think the 4% rule, or if it's now the 3.3% rule, whatever we want to call it, I think that's a good starting point to figure out how much you can take out of your investment portfolio. But, for clients that I work with and even, folks at home doing it themselves, I do not recommend using the 4% rule each and every year. And the reason why is because it's a static amount. It's a set amount that you just adjust for inflation, and it assumes no changes in your life. And I just think that's really unrealistic because your life in retirement is not going to be static. Just as, if you look back at the last 30 years of your life, your expenses in your 20s and 30s and 40s, they were not the same. I would be shocked if they were. Maybe when you're in your 20s, you spent less. In your 30s, you had kids, a lot of expenses there. Maybe your kids left and went off to college. Expenses might have gone up if you paid for it out of your cash flow. And then when the kids were grown and gone, maybe your expenses went down again. So life changed a lot in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. There is no reason, and I have not seen any evidence that your expenses in retirement will be the exact same each and every year. So I think it's foolhardy for us to assume, hey, just use the 4% rule, adjust for inflation, and that's what your retirement expenses are going to be each and every year. Life doesn't work out that way. I've seen studies done on this actual subject before. I have not seen retirees in mass numbers spending the same amount each and every year. And so I just don't think it's appropriate for us to assume that your income needs will be the same each and every year. And so the 4% rule in nerdy financial terms is a static withdrawal. It's a static distribution. That number stays the same, adjusted for inflation. What I recommend folks consider is a dynamic distribution strategy where you look into different factors in your life, in your investment portfolio, in the markets, and then you make your distribution strategies from there. You figure out what you need to distribute each and every year based on those other external factors, as well as what you've been spending and what you need to spend for your lifestyle. So I do not recommend static withdrawals. I think dynamic distributions are a much better fit, which means we need to go away from this 4% rule, the 3.3% rule, and use something that changes each and every year, just as your life changes, just as your portfolio changes. And I've talked about that specifically on episode number 36 of this podcast or YouTube channel. You can just search for it under the video section. Okay, and so that's my first main point in response to this article. The second main point that I want to make is that this study by Morningstar assumed a 50-50 portfolio. And what I mean by that is 50% in stocks, 50% in bonds. If you can increase the equity portion of your portfolio, if you can stomach that increased equity portion, that will enable you to likely, not a guarantee, I can't do guarantees on this show, but it will likely get you a higher rate of return from your investments and therefore get you a higher income amount. As we have seen over the last 100 years, and again, I don't know if the next 100 years are going to be the same as the last 100 years, but over the last 100 years, stock prices have gotten returns 2 to 3 times higher than bond returns. So again, if you can increase that equity portfolio, that's going to give you a better rate of return and a higher income amount. And so I don't know what the proper amount is for you out there at home. Maybe it's 60-40, 70-30, 80-20. I do think there is a portion of your investments that you do need to have bonds in there. I think there's a really good reason to have bonds in there. But I don't necessarily think you need to be as conservative as 50-50. But again, that goes up to your risk tolerance and what you're comfortable with, as well as how much you're going to get from Social Security and pension and these other income sources that you might have in retirement. The third and last point that I want to make in response to this article by CNBC and Morningstar is that when I was researching this, I saw a number of articles on this topic, and a few of them mentioned, hey, you should use a rule of thumb to determine your retirement expenses. And the rule of thumb was just assume that you're going to spend 75 to 80% of your income in retirement. And I think that's absolute garbage advice, and I do not think you should do it at all. And so the rule of thumb essentially, to use a really easy example, let's say you're making $100,000. This rule of thumb wants you to assume that you're going to spend $75,000 per year in your retirement. But I work with a lot of people who, honestly, they only want to spend, and maybe their house is paid for, they only want to spend $3,000 to $4,000 a year. $3,000 to $4,000 a month after taxes. And so, their idea of retirement isn't necessarily going on these exotic cruises, traveling, buying a $200,000 RV or anything like that. They just want their time back. They want to spend their time doing what they want when they get in their 50s, 60s, etc. And so they're not looking to spend lots of money, and they're not even trying to spend as much as they're spending in their working years. They just want their time back. So if you want your time back, then maybe you don't need to spend 75% of your income that you're making right now. So again, it's just a rule of thumb. I honestly don't think it's useful, and whenever you see that rule of thumb, I think you should completely ignore it. What I think you should do instead, and I make all of my clients do this when they work with me, and you can do this, if you're going to do it yourself also, is just categorize what you're spending right now in your working years. You can do that, with a simple spreadsheet. You can look through your bank statements, credit card statements, what have you. Mint.com has a good app for this. Figure out what you're spending right now. The second thing I want you to do is think about what you want to spend in retirement. So what expenses do you think will go down? What expenses do you want to increase? What travel budget do you want to put in there that you're maybe not spending now because you can't get enough time away from the office? I think figuring out what you actually are spending now, and then also thinking about what you're going to spend in the future. Yes, it's much more work. There's way more work involved, and it requires you to be intentional and honestly not to be lazy about it. I think this rule of thumb of 75% of your expenses, 75% of your income, I think it's a lazy rule of thumb for people who don't want to put in the work in figuring out what their ideal retirement expenses will be. I think when we're talking about a decision that's this important, you really should be willing to put in the work and figure out what you want to spend in retirement, because that's really going to be the gauge of how much money you need from your investment portfolio, not some kind of rule of thumb. So again, just to wrap up here as we get towards the end of the episode, Morningstar has done some really good research. They're really smart people over there. I don't doubt the research at all in terms of the 4% rule maybe being the 3.3% rule. I just think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I don't think you need to take a static withdrawal from your portfolio. I think you should take a different distribution each and every year depending on various other factors, which you can listen to in episode number 36. Second thing, I think you need to think about increasing your stock percentage in retirement. I know it makes some people a little queasy. It obviously depends on your specific circumstances and how comfortable you are taking on that risk. But if you can increase your stocks, even just by a little bit, it could potentially increase your returns and the income you can get and the longevity of your portfolio. And then the third thing that I have for you is don't use a lazy rule of thumb for one of the most important decisions of your entire financial life. I just don't think it makes any sense, and I don't think you should do it. I just think it promotes laziness, which, boy, I mean, I'm not talking about doing a ton of work. I'm just talking about doing a little extra grunt work, figuring out exactly what you need, and then going from there. Just don't use that stupid rule of thumb. Okay, so I hope I made myself clear, especially on that rule of thumb point. I might do a specific episode on rules of thumb that I really don't like and I think you should ignore maybe in the future. That's a really good idea. I'm going to write that down once I get done, hitting the end button on this video. So that's all I've got for today. Really appreciate you watching, listening, and I hope you all have a great week. Bye. Thanks again for listening. As a reminder, you should consult with a financial advisor familiar with the specific circumstances of your unique financial situation before making any financial decisions. Nothing in this podcast is a solicitation for the sale or purchase of any securities. Any mentions of rate of return are hypothetical in nature and not a guarantee of future returns. Scott Newhouse, CFP, is an investment advisor representative of Forthright Finances, a California and Nevada registered investment advisor.